Hello and welcome back to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we discuss all of the world's leaders and tell you who's winning and losing each week. This week I'm joined by Rory.
Hello.
Zach.
Hello.
And Nadja.
Hello.
How are we all doing?
Great.
Very well.
Yeah, very well actually.
I believe this is the 20th episode.
Yeah, you
Is
love
it?
counting them down.
It feels like a big deal.
Does it?
I don't know why, but
Okay.
Is there any special?
nothing
No.
special is
Oh,
happening.
okay.
This is a total
I
normal
thought
episode.
you were going to like a surprise guest.
Whoever's at the top of the
Yeah.
board at the end of the
Xi
episode.
Jinping just walks in. Yeah.
I reckon
Happy 20 episode, guys.
like a little cameo at the end. That's not happening. But what will be happening is we'll be moving winners up the board, we're moving losers down the board, and we will also be shuffling around based on the audience's suggestion. This is how the World League Leaderboard sits right now. This is the winners and losers at the moment. But let's get straight into it. Let's start moving people up and let's do our winners of the week. Zach, let's start with yours. Who is your winner of this week?
My win of the week is going to be Russian President Vladimir Putin. I think in general, it's probably fair to say that Putin has had a good few months, maybe. But I think that the reports that we saw earlier this week, and I think beginning in the weekend, actually, that Trump was considering, quote, giving up on Ukraine. That was a sentiment first articulated by Marco Rubio and then echoed by Trump in comments he made to White House reporters, like I think a day after Rubio said that basically if no deal was forthcoming, the US would walk away from the table. I think that was obviously good news in and of itself for Putin, because I think the subtext there is that if Trump does give up on a deal, it doesn't mean that he would escalate military aid to Ukraine, right? He would just sort of leave the status quo or maybe slowly withdraw military aid. I think that is his instinct there. But then this was all followed up by a Wall Street Journal report suggesting that the US, via Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's sort of Russia envoy, was going to offer Putin even more, what you might call concessions, depends where you think your sort of neutral negotiating ground is, but what we might call concessions to Putin in the form of American recognition, is that right?
Recognition?
Recognition is the better word, yeah. American recognition of Russia's, of Crimea as Russian territory, and then a freeze along the current front lines, which is obviously a far cry short of Zelensky's stated objective, which is to get back all of Russia's sort of pre-2014 territory, including Crimea. And I think that we're now getting reports, I mean, this is recorded on Wednesday, and I think basically last night and sort of into this morning, we're getting reports that Putin is considering basically accepting the terms of the ceasefire, accepting a freeze along the current front lines, and obviously not going to say no to America recognizing his claim to Crimea. I'm not sure that ceasefire will necessarily hold. I think the recent history suggests that, Putin sort of suggests that he's keen on a ceasefire before then imposing a whole load of conditions, which eventually collapse the whole thing. But either way, I think it's a win for Putin, right? I think if the ceasefire does hold, sure, he hasn't got the 4 oblasts that he claimed he would get. Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Luhansk and Donetsk, which were the ones that were sort of annexed via referendums in September 2022. But he's still got a big chunk of Ukrainian territory. He's still got America to recognize Crimea. And it's pretty clear that Trump won't offer any sort of American security guarantees after the fact. So I think if you even go back like a year ago, compare the best case scenario then to what Putin's got now, that's a pretty great result. He's basically, if he would get America out of Ukraine, he would get a fair chunk of Ukrainian territory, and not much to stop him having another pop in the future. And then if the negotiations collapse, as I just sort of suggested a second ago, it just means he gets to continue his war, and with probably, I would doubt for much more American support than Ukraine is already getting, right? And that's still pretty good. I mean, in the last few months, again, Russia has made slow but steady advances along the front lines, and Putin is clearly pretty happy with the status quo. So I basically think it looks like he might get a pretty good peace deal, especially if you compare to where things were a year ago. And even if that doesn't happen, it doesn't look like he's going to be struggling all that hard.
If we do achieve a ceasefire and then it falls apart, what do you think that looks like for Russia, for their relationship with Trump, with the US? Because obviously partly why Trump is doing this is because he's frustrated that, as you said, that this isn't going as fast as he hoped, hasn't had as much success in negotiations as he hoped. If Trump puts all this effort in, makes all these concessions, and then Putin backs out or it falls apart. Do you think that damages that relationship longer term? Do you think that makes things worse for Putin, the fact that Trump's gone down this route? Or do you think it doesn't make that much difference?
I think it would clearly strain that relationship. I mean, you saw that after Putin sort of quietly reneged on the first ceasefire, right? And then Trump came out with some comments that were slightly off brand for him, basically having a go at Putin and saying, Putin is continuing the war. We need to get a ceasefire done now. But I think, after those comments, for instance, it wasn't like Trump suddenly changed course. It wasn't like he suddenly started escalating military support to Ukraine or sort of doing anything that might threaten Putin. He basically made some upset noises and then came back and said, okay, fine, we'll give you even more. We'll give you Crimea. We'll give you a freeze on the current front lines, all that sort of shenanigans. And it's not, still Ukraine won't join NATO and there won't be any sort of post-war American security guarantees. So I think, assuming that pattern holds, you might see some tension in that relationship between Trump and Putin. But I wouldn't expect that to massively change American policy on this front. I wouldn't expect that to lead to Trump sort of really backing Ukraine or, again, some sort of security guarantee. I think it will just be maybe a furious Truth Social post. And then I would imagine a sort of slow withdrawal from Ukraine then, right? I imagine that he would continue sort of providing the same level of military aid to Ukraine. But I think his instincts are that Ukraine is not good value for money for the American taxpayer.
Sure.
And it's clear that he wants to focus more on China, or at least lots of people in the administration do. And I think that they think that the attention on Ukraine is detracting from America's, what should be America's focus on China, right? So I just think over the medium to longer term, what would happen in that situation is that America would slowly wind down its support for Ukraine and probably ask Europe to step up. That's not the worst case scenario from Ukraine's perspective. A sort of gradual winding down of American aid is far better than a sudden one. But it's definitely not a good outcome.
Yeah. What do you think this means for Europe and Europe's reaction to the war? Obviously, as you say, this would require European intervention because if the US is offering no security guarantees, things like that, Europe will obviously have to meet that gap. What do you think this means both for Europe's reaction to Ukraine, but also the ever under strain European-US relationship?
I think either way, it's bad news for the European-US relationship.
Yeah.
I think in a way, it's actually harder for Europe if there is a ceasefire agreed in the short term, because that requires quite an immediate reaction, right? And Europe isn't very good at doing things quickly. If there's a ceasefire that's immediately guaranteed, and then it depends on the terms of ceasefire, right? But let's just imagine that Trump just says, okay, ceasefire guaranteed on the current front lines. I'm now withdrawing all American support. It's up to the Europeans. That means very, very quickly, the Europeans have to sort out some sort of way to guarantee that ceasefire. And the most obvious way of doing that, obviously, is this thing we've been talking about for months, which is some sort of European peacekeeping force, which, I mean, Putin sounds really unclear, sounds really not keen on. So he might rule that out as part of the negotiations. But assuming he doesn't, that's what Europe will have to do. Or at least they'll have to bolster their sort of presence in the Baltics and in Poland, etc. That would require quite dramatic, quite sharp, quite immediate action. And I don't think Europe is necessarily cut out for that at the moment. I also think that quite a lot of Europe's sort of bandwidth is currently occupied with dealing with the trade war and the sort of economic disruption that Trump has brought about. I think in the sort of other outcome, which is where no ceasefire is agreed and Trump sort of gradually winds down support, I think that's actually, it's not, there are no good outcomes here, right? But I actually think that's a pretty manageable outcome from Europe's perspective. I think Europe would much prefer to be sort of gradually increasing support over the next couple of years, as opposed to sort of suddenly having to muster a 10, 20,000 strong peacekeeping force to deploy in Ukraine, or even bigger. Zelensky's talking about 150,000 strong peacekeeping force. I think that would be very, very difficult. And I think, we've seen quite a lot of, and I don't mean to be too negative about these things, but I think we've seen quite a lot of quite grandiose rhetoric coming from Europe, especially after that sort of Oval Office spat between Vance, Trump and Zelensky. But apart from this talk about some joint EU funding, the debt issued at the European level, we haven't actually seen many concrete steps towards what you might call like a sort of, a European-wide security architecture. And I think, that suggests that there are still political hurdles to creating some sort of European wide, load-bearing security architecture, right? And I think in that case, what you probably actually see is the Brits and maybe the French sort of hurriedly deploying troops. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but if you're a sort of Macronite strategic autonomy guy, this would be a missed opportunity to deepen European integration in the service of security autonomy.
Okay, so that sees Putin move up to the middle of the board in the neutral space. Zelensky's still right down there at the bottom. So a real spread there, probably a fair reflection of what's going on right now in that conflict. Let's move on next to Nadja. Who is your winner of the week?
So my winner of the week is Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. The essential reason being is that this Monday, she visited the White House. She visited Trump, being the first European leader to do so, to receive an invitation from the president after he initiated his whole trade war with the world and with Europe. As we know, he's put now like a 90-day pause on those tariffs. So I think, so for Europe, it's a 20% blanket tariff. And Giorgia Meloni, she was invited to the White House, and her aim in essentially all of that was to try and not negotiate a trade deal with Trump or anything like that, but just kind of see if he can soften his stance towards Europe. Now, Meloni, she's kind of for a while being considered as the kind of Trump whisperer in Europe. They have really similar political ideologies. They're both populists, but more than that, he considers her like his own personal Trump whisperer. Like he's like lauded her with a lot of praise. She was the only European leader to be invited to his inauguration in January. And essentially he sees her as like the special envoy for Europe, like the person to call. So meeting went well, really positive outcome. Basically what Trump said, he's not going to drop the tariffs just yet, and he likely won't in the next few months anyways, but he did come out to say that, and this is again Trump saying something, so we can't take this, word for word, but he did say there will 100% be a trade deal with Europe. That was followed right after the meeting with Meloni, and that he's accepted an invitation to Rome to visit Meloni, and Meloni's now hoping that this is kind of the first stepping block for Trump to be more engaged with Europe, but particularly with the European Commissioner, Ursula von der Leyen. So they have no communication at all, and Meloni's kind of seen as this kind of bridge between the US and Europe to try and initiate a good conversation. So she's the winner of the week because she managed to do so, and things have taken a more positive turn. We'll see how long it lasts, but that's that.
She's winning because she's got the power and the influence and the connections, but equally she's given herself a very difficult sounding job there trying to bridge that gap.
Definitely, yeah.
Presumably because of that ideological alliance, she's a pretty good fit for kind of finding a middle ground. Do you think that she'll find much success in this role? Do you think there is some kind of commonality to be found between Europe and Trump? Or do you think this is kind of a wasted effort to some extent, that sure, someone needs to, there can't just be a divide between Europe and the US, but that this is just an impossible task to bridge that gap?
Well, I think ideologically there is nothing really to bridge. I think it's more just the practicalities of the kind of, working trade relationship between the two. I think if she is able to soften his stance and kind of sweeten his tooth.
Sweeten the deal?
Sweeten the deal, yeah.
Sweeten his teeth.
I don't know.
Dentists hate that analogy.
Don't know where that came from, but then that would be great. With that being said, what you said at the start of your question as well, that she's put herself in a difficult position, that's definitely correct, because she's got, not only is she balancing Europe and Trump, she's also balancing Europe and Italy, in the sense that the Italians at home, they've praised her for like her visit to the White House and everything like that. But Italy's in a quite particular position when it comes to Trump and America, because they're, I think, the third largest European importers to the US after Germany and Ireland. So there's a massive trade.
Exporters.
Exporters. So there's a massive trade imbalance between the two.
Yeah.
And so if the tariffs do go, if Trump is down for the tariffs, putting 20%, that's going to really hurt Italian manufacturers. So you've got her kind of coalition who are kind of pushing her, just make a fast deal. That's kind of the vibe. Just make a fast deal, like not forget Europe, but like, put Italy first. And that's been her kind of whole thing ever since she got into power 2 years ago, Italy first. But at the same time, she's got this kind of like new leader of Europe mantle that's been bestowed on her by the continent. And she needs to balance that with, pushing European interests as well with Italian ones. So yeah, it's a difficult position.
It is interesting, as you say there, that like when she first entered power 2-3 years ago, I'm not sure we would have predicted that she would end up in the position she's in right now. And it talks a lot to the thing that we're always going on about, the lack of leadership in Europe, the lack of clear direction, that there is such a gap that someone that you previously would have expected would be a fringe kind of further right figure has become one of the standard bearers of Europe because, partly because of circumstance with Trump, but also because of how Europe sits right now, that she really has, on our board, she's found herself as one of the highest Europeans on the board, one of few notable Europeans on the board at all. Like I was just looking through, there's a good number of European countries that aren't represented at all. And Maloney's right up there as one of the leaders. Rory, let's move on to you. Who is your winner of the week?
So my winner of the week is the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I don't think he's moved very much on our board, but he's quietly been doing a pretty good job, I think. The headline this week is that Greece, I'm going to get my numbers out. Greece recorded a 1.3% budget surplus last year, which made it one of 6 EU members with a surplus in 2024, which is a pretty good number overall. But I think when you sort of look back a decade, maybe a bit more than a decade ago, when Greece was mired in the debt crisis and Northern European countries were disparaging it, and it looked pretty terrible for Greece. That's a real remarkable turnaround. So not only have they recorded that budget surplus, but the IMF is predicting 2% growth this year for the Greek economy, which is pretty solid. That's higher than the 0.8% that is forecast for the Eurozone as a whole. And all of this sort of economic good news has enabled the Greek government to put together this €1 billion support package for, I think, renters and senior citizens. So that will cover about 80% of households in the country that will be getting some kind of financial support this year from the government. So yeah, for Mitsotakis, it's been pretty good. And that's reflected in polling. His party, I think it's New Democracy, their sort of centre-right party, they're comfortably still in first place. They have been since they were first elected. And part of that is because the opposition parties haven't quite worked out how to challenge him. And I think it's since the 2019 election, I think we've had 3 different parties as the sort of main opposition, sort of rising and falling. Now there's a new one that's sort of come out of nowhere. So there's that divide among the opposition has enabled him to sort of strengthen his position as prime minister, and the economic figures have just bolstered him. So yeah, he's a winner.
Interesting. You're right. I think it's probably the only second time he's moved. I think he entered the board going down and now has returned to neutral. I'm interested what the rest of the panel think of this, because as Rory said, Greece, not a country you expect this of, and also not a country we talk about a whole lot. So what do we make of this movement? What do we make of kind of Greece's position in Europe at the moment more broadly?
Yeah, I don't know that much about like the specifics of the domestic political situation in Greece. But what I would say is I do think there's quite an interesting, and we've done a couple of videos on this, there's quite an interesting take going around at the moment, right? Which is that all of those southern European countries that were forced into quite severe bouts of austerity during the Eurozone crisis have suddenly started doing relatively well. Spain is another sort of half example, right? Where pursued a series of labour market reforms, cut spending in certain areas, and now look, they're sort of growing again. I think there's a half truth to this, right? Which is that Greece, for instance, is doing better than you might have expected in, say, 2017, when it looked like austerity had basically ruined the Greek economy. But I think we should be careful not to overstate this, right? In that, like, if you expand your x-axis and you look at the longer time horizon, Greek GDP per capita sort of dips and is now coming back up, but it's still pretty, if you, on a longer time horizon, the net growth is still pretty meager, right? And I think if you asked your average Greek citizen how they feel about their economy, they probably wouldn't feel like, oh, it's doing great. Sure, some pretty ruthless labour market reforms have paid dividends, but it's not like Greece is now suddenly booming Germany-style economy, right? And yeah, I just think that I want to caution against that a little bit. You see that narrative pop up in places being like, oh, look, the recent success of the Greek economy proves that austerity was the right choice or whatever. And these sort of quite neoliberal reforms were correct or were worth it in the long term. But I just think that's really true. And like, you have to imagine the relevant counterfactual is one where Greece instead is supported by, let's say, the ECB, and goes to like a period of stimulus, and maybe the growth rates are just higher, even if debt doesn't necessarily come down. A bit more like America, although the analogy is sort of strained there, because America went for big stimulus instead of austerity after various crises, unlike Europe. And I think, in that counterfactual, I actually still imagine the Greek economy maybe is doing better. I'm not saying that the debt levels were sustainable. I'm just saying that I think that people can overdo this narrative a little bit. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. Nigel?
Yeah. I mean, there's also like with these like southern economies, Italy, for instance, they also received a lot of money from like the COVID fund and from like, EU help support and stuff like that. Doesn't necessarily, and their economies also depend a lot on tourism. Like obviously Spain's done a lot better at trying to kind of diversify that, and Italy as well. They have their manufacturing sector, but I know Greece is still quite, dependent on the tourist sector as well. So, it's not out of the woods yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like quite a lot of the recent growth, right, has been not just entirely right, an uptick in tourism, which accounts for more than 10% of GDP in some of these countries.
Yeah.
So it's not like this is like super sustainable, industrial-led growth.
Sure.
Or anything like that. I just want to caution against that. You see that narrative pop up somewhere.
Yeah, you definitely
in
do.
sort of like pro-austerity hawks. And I just think it's not entirely right.
Interesting.
For the record, I wasn't being a pro-austerity hawk when I was making my point. Yeah.
Okay. Before we move on to the next section, I wanted to quickly mention our magazine, Too Long, which we talk about every week. But this week, more relevant than ever, because the magazine is here. We have loads of copies of it. I mean, there's one over there.
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, you still haven't seen it yet? You weren't here last week?
No, I wasn't here last week.
We haven't even got that many left. Honestly, we've sold about
Yeah, we're just bragging on the podcast now.
85% of the stock is already gone. So get your hands on some quick.
85% of the stock is already gone.
The last minute, I've just had you like gasping, like, oh, what? No way.
But the point is that if you order a copy now, we will just ship it right to you. There's no delay. There's no pre-ordering. None of that. You can just get a copy right away. And as we've talked about a whole bunch of times before, this latest issue is all about the world's most influential people. We run through the top 25 and we talk about who they are, how they wield their influence, the struggles they're having, how their influence works. Obviously, this list was created by the team and the audience. So there's a bunch of interesting data about how our opinions diverge and the differences between how you perceive them and how we perceive them. It's a really interesting issue of the magazine, and I think you will really enjoy it if you enjoy a show like this, which is obviously all about influence and power and different people and different countries. So if you're interested, you can grab a copy and it'll be sent straight to you. The other thing I will say is all of the discounts we offer on the magazine are rooted around subscriptions, and your last chance to subscribe is by the end of this week. At the end of this week, we will turn off subscriptions for this issue of the magazine, and if you subscribe, the first one you'll get is the August edition, not this one. So if you want to subscribe, if you want to get all of the discounts you can, and you want a copy of this latest issue, this week is your last opportunity. And this probably was the last time we mention it in any content. So if you're thinking, I'll do it later, I'll get round to it, you won't. Let's be honest with yourself. You'll forget. So if you want to do it, do it. And if you don't, just be honest with yourself. If you do want the best deal you can get on subscription, though, if you use code LASTCHANCE, all one word, you can get £3 off any subscription, which means, for instance, were you to buy a physical copy, that normally will be $12.99, but you also get 20% off for subscribing, $10.39, and another £3 off, $7.39. It's a crazy deal. And as I say, subscriptions are being turned off for this issue at the end of the week. So use code LASTCHANCE because it really is your last opportunity to do so. Okay, let's move on to our audience suggestion for who we should be moving on the board. So as always, the top comment on the previous episode dictates the person we move in this section, the audience suggestion section. And the top comment last week was South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. So we'll run down the the panel. Each of you can say whether you think he's a winner or a loser. And then based on that, we will move him either up or down. For the record, he is currently in the lightly negative section. So he could be moving neutral or he could be moving into the pretty hard negative section. Rory, I'll start your end. Is Cyril a winner or a loser this week?
Cyril.
Our boy Cyril, he's watching.
He's a loser this week for me.
It's going to be awkward at the end of the video when he congratulates us on the big 2-0.
Just waiting off camera to come in. He's a loser this week for one main reason, at least from my perspective. There's a pretty landmark poll that came out in South Africa that showed his party, the ANC, in second place below his coalition partners, the Democratic Alliance or the DA, only by a few, I think, less than a percentage point. But it's the first poll ever since the end of apartheid that the ANC hasn't been in first place. And so this is a continuation of their slow decline, where the election last year, they lost their majority for the first time. And, I guess a sort of optimistic take for them at the time might have been, we've hit this dip, we'll go into a coalition government and hopefully sort of rebuild ourselves. But this just shows that decline is continuing. And it sort of comes amid this ongoing strain in the government over a whole load of things, but most recently the budget, which his party passed through Parliament without the support of the Democratic Alliance, which really strained relations between the coalition partners. There's always talk about, is this the point that the coalition collapses? I still don't think it is going to be that point, but it's sort of always a risk at some point, I suppose. But it does go to show that his strategy so far in this coalition government hasn't been sort of paying off at the polls, in the polls, I should say. Yeah.
So it doesn't sound great. Zach, winner or loser?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so there are these recurring disputes, always around the budget or some specific spending program, right? With the DA genuinely being a bit more skeptical of big spending programs or anything that is sort of fiscally loose, and the ANC generally being more supportive of those sorts of policies. And there were these recurring disputes where it looks like the ANC have essentially violated the coalition agreement and basically gone ahead with one of these without the support of the DA. I mean, the budget being the most obvious example. And what seems to have paid off for the DA is just by playing the adults in the room, right? And just saying, look, it's fine. We're going to keep the coalition together for the good of South Africa. And that seems to have really worked for them. I was just going to say, so there was that poll. And then I think yesterday, or even maybe even today, there was another poll out amongst, I think basically the poorest quartile of South African households, right? So really, really poor South Africans, showing that not only were the DA ahead of the ANC, but the DA won about 40%, and next place was the EFF, and then third place was the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is, I think it's Julius Malema's the leader. Yeah. And it's a really, really radical sort of left wing. I think it describes itself as Marxist. And I think it's probably fair to say, I think they have this in the past described as sort of like a sort of black nationalist party. And they are a very, very radical party. And the fact that they are polling ahead of the ANC with poor South Africans is quite something, especially because the ANC's sort of voter base used to be essentially poor black South Africans.
Yeah.
So
loser.
Really, I think really quite big loser. And I do think this is the fact that the DA are riding so high in the polls is really, if you're from South Africa, I mean, it's really it's a massive story. I mean, it's you wouldn't historically they polled around sort of 15%, right, and the ANC have been 60%, whatever it is. And even at the last election, they only won 20 something in the 20s, and the fact they're now ahead of the ANC, that's pretty massive.
Nadia, it'd be bold of you to come out and say he's a winner at this point.
I think Rory and Zach summed it up pretty well, and loser of the week as well.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Wow. When he bursts out the wall behind me in a minute, it's going to be very awkward. Well, sticking with losers, let's move into our losers of the week. Okay, Zach, let's start with you. Who is your loser this week?
I feel a bit boring doing this again, but I'm putting Trump down again.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know, crazy. There's two reasons for this. I mean, the first is that the polling for him has soured somewhat in the past past week or so. Sort of unsurprising. It's the first poll to come out since really Liberation Day. And the headline approval rating is actually okay for him. I mean, they're pretty bad by historical standards, right? He's definitely underwater. His net approval rating is sort of -5 or -10, depending on which pollster you ask. But what I think is more worrying is that his polling on specific issues, especially around the economy, is really, really quite rubbish. And I think Gallup released polling today saying that in the first time since they started asking this question, a majority of Americans now say their financial situation, they are worse off today.
Yeah.
Or they think their financial situation is going to deteriorate in the near future. That's pretty massive because like an outright majority, that's above 50%, obviously. And normally that question, basically, it's about sort of when a Republican is in charge, about 30% say, mainly Democrats, basically say things are getting worse. And about 40% of Republicans say things are getting better. And conversely, when a Democrat is in charge, the fact that an outright majority are now saying that they expect their financial situation to deteriorate is pretty rubbish. But then I think the other thing is that last couple of days, we've seen what looked like a couple of tentative U-turns from Trump, right? So the first one happened a couple of days ago, Monday, I think, which was when Scott Bessent told a closed-door meeting at JP Morgan of basically like hedge funds and investors that the tariffs on China were, quote, unsustainable, the implication being they are going to wind them down at some point. This was a sentiment that was quickly echoed by Trump, I think on Tuesday, basically, just again talking up the deal and saying that the tariffs are going to come down. I think that, by the way, that essentially represents a bit of a capitulation, right? The Chinese have said nothing about, they're not making any concessions, that they want to stick with their tariffs. The fact that Trump is talking about winding them down is not because China has suddenly come around to a deal, it's because I think Trump has realized belatedly that the tariffs are a losing proposition politically. And at the same time, he made similar comments talking about the Jerome Powell and the prospect of firing him, right? So this is something that Trump has been talking about for the past couple of days. He's been saying, I'm going to fire the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, because he's not cutting interest rates fast enough. That has obviously spooked markets. And I think on Tuesday afternoon, Trump said, I'm not going to fire him. Did a sort of screeching U-turn on that front. I think this, in a way, by the way, is good news for America, because I think before yesterday, Trump did look like he was very much set on basically some very inflationary tariff policies, and then sacking the Federal Reserve chair or forcing him to somehow cut interest rates despite those inflationary risks to make sure that the economy continued ticking along. And that was going to be a crazy dangerous combination. So I think the U-turn is good for America, but I think it's bad for Trump, right? And I think it is tentative evidence. I mean, we'll see. Trump likes changing his mind a fair bit. But I do think it looks like the beginning of the sort of moderation of Trump's second term, right? It looks like people like Bessent have won over. And I think that's, again, I do think it's probably good for America in the aggregate. I wasn't convinced by Trump's policy proposal of sort of tariffs and interest rate cuts. But I don't think it's good for Trump. I think it will end up being a sort of like a pretty boring second term if Wall Street continue to, if it looks like Wall Street have won over the internal battle within Trump's administration, right? I think it'll look a lot more like his first term.
Interesting. That all those posters he printed out, that big Liberation Day.
I know.
All those posters, all the excitement.
It might change. He's changed his mind the whole time, but
Maybe.
I actually think that the Jerome Powell thing was the most telling, right? Because the tariffs thing, he changed his mind on the whole time, but the Powell thing, he has been just escalating against Powell since really November, right? And that was such a sharp turnaround. It reminded me a bit of the Liberation Day turnaround we saw when Trump said that people getting the bond market was getting yippy, which it was one of those moments where like clearly financial reality just bit, and he just like, okay, I can't do this. And I think that that to me does suggest that, because once you accepted that you're not firing Jerome Powell, right, then there are a whole load of economic constraints kick in down the line. If you're not going to cut interest rates, then the economy is going to stall, right? And then if Trump doesn't want the economy to stall, which he presumably won't, he's going to have to do something like ease off on the tariffs. Yeah. So I think that once you've accepted that you're not firing Powell, the consequences just means that you can't pursue as radical an agenda as you were going to, unless you're happy to sort of force a recession on the American people for a couple of years.
Yeah, it'll be interesting what route he takes from here, because obviously, as you say, it sounds like a lot of his financial plans have been limited and are changing based on the market realities we always knew would come into play, and economists were warning about ahead of time. It'll be interesting the rest of his kind of portfolio and the rest of what he wants to do. Portfolio is too generous. The rest of his plans, because obviously the economic situation isn't the only contentious issue at the moment in the US. You've obviously got all of the immigration issues, all of the ICE stuff, among a whole bunch of other issues obviously too. So it'll be interesting how his focus changes if tariff stops being his big attention grabbing thing. What comes next? What does he aim for next? And currently it looks like immigration is already that thing, but it'll be interesting to see how that shifts if he's forced to have a boring time economically. Does he then change his plans elsewhere?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's always been immigration. I think even before this U-turn, he was already domestically they were focusing a lot on immigration, right? And I think in that sense, by the way, the battle with the Supreme Court is safer because there aren't market-related costs to it in the same way the battle with Powell, with Jay Powell, I can't say that on the podcast, where the battle with the Federal Reserve was. But yeah, I think that they will pivot towards immigration.
Wild, as you say, the Fed and Jerome Powell are like a more safe institution than, a more intimidating institution to fight with than the Supreme Court.
Don't get me started.
It's crazy.
Get me started. Jay Powell runs the world, baby.
He's on the list. He's one of our most influential people.
He is actually.
Where he is on the list.
Can I say one more thing?
You have to buy the magazine, but he's in the top 25. I can tell you that.
I know. Can I say one more thing while we're talking about? I do think this isn't. I think you can think of the whole Trump saga feels like a special case, right? But in lots of ways, what Trump is experiencing is actually a very familiar phenomenon to anyone who lives in Europe, right? In that both France and the UK have faced similar problems where policies that apparently the public voted for just bump up against the markets and no one really knows what to do, right? Like Trump, he did talk a lot about massive tariffs and reindustrializing America. And, in the same way that both the left and the right in France promised to borrow a whole load of money and then were told by the bond markets, no, you can't. He's bumping up against the markets. Yeah. And I don't know. I think that I think people who don't like Trump will sort of delight in this, right?
Yeah.
In that someone is, Jay Powell wins against Trump. But I think in a way, like it feels like the democracy is being curtailed in some sense. I mean, maybe there are just fiscal limits on what you can do, right? But I don't know. I feel mildly uncomfortable at like quite how little political space now exists, given how much basically modern economies depend on international markets.
Yeah.
And the last thing I say is this is something that actually, after World War II, policymakers were really worried about, which is why we had capital controls and why John Maynard Keynes pushed for them, is that if you don't have them, you always just basically risk capital flight. And once you risk capital flight, that means you basically have to appease the rich people with lots of capital.
Yeah.
I don't sound too like aggressively left wing about it. I'm not trying. I'm just think there does seem to me like I just feel a little bit uneasy about the lack of political space that dependence on international markets, which is basically just inevitable these days, sort of creates.
It's an interesting take. Interesting. Let's move to you, Nadia.
Are you smiling because you agree or because...
Yeah, I do agree.
Okay.
Nadia, who is your loser of the week?
Yes, my loser of the week is the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. A couple of reasons. Well, actually, two main reasons. He's facing a lot of, he has been facing a lot of political domestic turmoil for the past, ever since kind of October 7th and his inability to, decide on a hostage deal with Hamas. But, and I'll get to that more in a second, but internationally speaking, he's also facing a bit of trouble when France's President Emmanuel Macron came out and said sometime last week that France will move to recognize Palestine. Now, France's position and most European nations' position on Palestine for the past few years or decades has been a two-state solution. So none of this is actually really big news. This was France's stance for a while anyways, but he has said that by June, there could be the possibility to recognize Palestine. So what's changed is just that the fact that it will actually, come into fruition. Yeah. And there's a deadline set. So that obviously, that's not great for Netanyahu. Obviously, Emmanuel Macron, he's, Europe's big guy, and he's saying he's moving to recognize Palestine.
Not Europe's big guy.
Yeah, Europe's big guy.
That's a great nickname.
A handful of other European countries could move to follow. And we did see this happen last year when I think Spain, Norway, Ireland, maybe I can't remember if it was Slovenia as well. As well, all kind of moved around at the same time to do the exact same thing. And if you have France, which is, Europe's biggest economy, one of the most important countries in the continent.
Second after Germany.
Sorry, second after Germany.
Europe's big guy, though.
He's big guy. He's undeniably the big guy.
Matt's not a big guy.
No,
Rishol,
not yet.
Not yet. Then, that could set a domino effect, which
Yeah.
obviously Netanyahu doesn't want. He responded to Macron's comments by saying, this is a disgrace, and you're, what was it? Something like you're justifying terrorism or safekeeping terrorism, something like that. So that's not great for Netanyahu. And also domestically, he's facing a big backlash now after his bids to dismiss the chief intelligence
Intelligence chief.
the intelligence chief in Israel. And yeah, essentially there was, I'm not too familiar with the subject completely, but there was a whole thing, and I think actually Rory may know more about the subject than me. But if you
We'll see.
step in and save me at some point. But
He's just going to in the corner.
Yeah.
but essentially Netanyahu moved to kind of dismiss the intelligence chief over various different things. One of the two things was over Qatargate, and also apparently the chief's refusal to spy on Israeli protesters protesting the war. And now he's faced a lot of backlash for that, and the opposition have labeled him as a security threat to Israel and have told him he needs to step down. So just a lot of kind of things exploding for Netanyahu all at once. So that's why he's a loser of this week. But yes.
A lot of things.
Yeah,
to be
sorry.
fair, that is
The
a pretty
last
comprehensive
minute entry.
argument. No, totally fair enough. So many things is a good thing. It's evidence of the thing.
Yeah.
True.
The volume of things is in itself a thing.
This is good.
Obviously, as we've said, Trump has his attention all over the place. He's dealing with Supreme Court battles. He's dealing with Zach's mate Jay Powell. He is trying to sort things out with Russia. He has hit the bottom of the world leaderboard, most notably. What do you think Netanyahu's situation looks like and his position looks like? And is it affected by that relationship with Trump and Trump's variety of priorities and the fact that Israel does seem to be slipping down that list?
Well, I think one thing about Netanyahu is that he has managed consecutively to survive these kind of political crises at home. And I don't think this kind of, all these things that I just mentioned will necessarily lead to him stepping down or to resignation, even though the heat is, heating for him. I don't think it won't lead to like some kind of big resignation for him. I think he's managed so far to kind of keep his head above water for a very long time, with Trump not being in office during those periods as well. So I don't think there's necessarily too much of a relationship there. But I don't know, maybe if...
I think one of the worrying, slightly adjacent to Trump, but the worrying thing with what Nadja just said is that with all these things mounting for Netanyahu, multiple domestic crises, his corruption trial, all sorts of things like that, he's so defiant that it probably means he's just going to escalate on some front or on all fronts, whether it's Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Iran.
Yeah.
Like it's...
there were lots of reports he wanted to he was trying to push Trump for direct strikes on Iran.
And then Trump, denied or...
Yeah, I think that's another reason why, by the way, things are not going well for him.
That's true.
Well, that's because he did have... There was quite a humiliating, maybe too strong a word, but he had a White House meeting with Trump, and he sort of... Netanyahu went over there to try and sort out tariff stuff as well as other things, but he had to sort of sit there nodding along as Trump ended up praising Erdogan massively, who is someone Netanyahu really doesn't like. And Trump's been claiming that he and Netanyahu are on the same page on everything, which just isn't true, really. He has sort of given Israel like carte blanche to just, escalate in the West Bank or Gaza. Like Trump doesn't seem to care that much about that. But Iran, Zach, you're probably about to start saying this, I'll hand over to you, but Iran seems to be the front where they really are sort of on two sides.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you just referenced a True Social post where he said that him and Netanyahu are on the same side. I think that came out this morning, UK time, right? So maybe Trump has come around to Netanyahu's way of thinking on Iran, but there are well-sourced reports basically that Netanyahu was pushing Trump for direct strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And it does look like so far Trump has basically rebuffed Netanyahu, and I think in lots of ways, well, maybe not too strong, but to Trump's credit, he does look like he's pushing for a deal with Iran. And actually, in the end, by the way, that I have a suspicion that it'll end up quite a lot looking like the Obama deal with Iran that Trump then pulled out of. But the sounds coming out of Iran are very, very positive. Iran, lots of senior figures, including, by the way, Ayatollah Khomeini, at least according to a sort of indirect report from Pezeshkian, who's the current president, are now talking about American investments in Iran's nuclear industry. That's a crazy idea. You know, if this had been floated in 2015, you would have been like, what is going on? But it's the sort of weird deal that Trump apparently is like quite open to.
Yeah.
You know, you can see how that works. What's clearly happens, the Iranians have clearly seen that Trump loves these like American companies investing in, you know, Russia or Iran or whatever, and has gone, well, why don't we just offer him that?
Yeah.
And if that works, that is a wild deal. Like, right, that is, for anyone who's worried about nuclear escalation in Iran, that's a great deal. I'm so happy if Iran basically agrees supervision of its nuclear program in exchange for American companies building the reactors. That's a great, it's incredible. But it's not good news for Netanyahu, right? Who basically wants, both for, I think, domestic political reasons, I think it's fair to assume that at this point, and because obviously he's worried about Iran, who's basically been pushing Trump to just strike Iran's nuclear facilities head on. But I think even Trump realizes that, like, it's not even clear America could do that successfully, could destroy Iran's nuclear facilities successfully, and B, it would just be the most extraordinary catastrophe, especially for a guy who's come to office promising to be a deal maker. The last thing I was, I do think this speaks to something that we've actually covered quite a lot on the channel, which is that Iran is in a really weak position right now. This is the time to make an Iran deal. The Iranian economy is in a bit of a mess. The Ayatollahs are genuinely very, very unpopular in Iran. There is a looming succession crisis. Falling oil prices, by the way, are yet more bad news for the Iranian economy, although worryingly, oil prices spiked off that back of the Truth Social post that we were talking about, because everyone was like, okay, that sounds like we're getting strikes on Iran. But the Iranians are in a really weak position. And I do think that there is space for a deal there, especially because if Trump wants American investment in Iran, go crazy. You know, if that's what he wants, that's such an easy thing for the Iranians to offer.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing is that I think Trump will also be being pushed by the Saudis. Trump has always been quite close to the Saudis. I think MBS was his first state visit in his first term. He's already been to Saudi at the kingdom. There's something I don't think we talked about on our channel, but last week or the week before, the Saudi foreign minister went to Iran the first time in like 20 years. That's you cannot imagine that happening even a couple of years ago. It is a symptom of the fact that basically the Saudis, the Iranians, the entire region is just worried about Israel at the moment. Yeah. And the Saudis will be in Trump's ear saying, this cannot happen. You cannot strike Iran.
Yeah.
So what I do think, in a way, you know, if Trump can do this deal, I think it would be great for the region. It would rule out Israeli strikes on Iran. And it could also pave the way for deeper normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the other Arab states in Iran, which could be good news. I think there's a great site called Amwaj, which does English language coverage of especially Iranian politics. And the sounds that the comments that have been made by even hardline Iranian officials are just more positive than they have ever been about the prospect of a deal. There was a guy, I mean, again, Ayatollah Khomeini, he, according to Pezeshkian, has said that I'm open to US investment in Iran. You cannot imagine that a couple of years ago. And Raisi, who was the hardline president until he died in the helicopter crash last year, his most senior official has also just come out and said the same thing, that hardliners are keen on American investment in Iran. You just can't, I don't understand what's marked this shift, but like those noises are incredibly optimistic for anyone who wants an Iran deal.
Well, sounds like we know who our winners of the week are for next week.
Yeah, true, actually, yeah.
Rory, let's move down to you finally for the loser of the week. Who's your loser of the week?
My loser of the week is Shigeru Ishiba, the Prime Minister of Japan. It's Trump related again, but Japan's growth forecast has been nearly halved by the IMF for this year, sort of amid the ongoing Trump trade war. Japan is particularly vulnerable as an export-heavy economy to Trump's tariffs. Obviously, they're now on the 10% sort of baseline tariff because Trump paused everything for 90 days. But Japan is, the whole world is still subject to the 25% automobile tariff, which is a big deal for Japan because they're a big car exporter. So Japan was one of the first I think it was the first countries to send a delegation to the White House to try and have talks to sort of settle these issues. It was a very high profile visit. Trump was in some of the talks himself, but they came away not just with nothing, but sort of not even knowing what they need to do to get something.
Yeah.
They discovered that, I think some news organizations describe Japan as the guinea pig in the trade talks because they were the first ones. And I think all they learned is that they're not sure what Trump wants out of them, and Trump isn't sure what Trump wants out of them. So that's bad news for them in trying to reach some kind of agreement. And it's sort of a sign to the rest of the world when they go and enter into these trade negotiations that actually it's not as simple as just going in and sort of being nice to Trump, because it's not clear that he even knows what he wants. So yeah, Japan is in a particularly difficult time because of Trump's tariffs. And there's also, I mean, interesting, I haven't seen it covered much, but there's a massive surge in rice, massive surge in the price of rice in Japan, which, the staple food. They've had to ship in rice from South Korea for the first time in like 20 years, I think. So that's a sort of interesting subplot going on that's pushed up the cost of living for people and makes Ishiba's job a little bit more difficult.
Rice prices going up.
Yeah.
That feels like a video.
Does
Rice
Not
price
a good one, but it feels like one we might pitch.
Yeah.
I can imagine the Minecraft animations already.
That's true.
There's no
Yeah.
rice in Minecraft, is there?
No.
I'm sure there'll be like a mod.
There
That's
must
not
be.
talk. That's just gonna make us sound incredibly lame.
I've not played it in a while. There might be rice
25-year-olds talking about Minecraft mods. The silver lining, I do think, is that the yen has fared very well recently.
now.
So,
That is true.
I think that it's always hard to say this is a good thing or a bad thing for the Japanese economy, because obviously Japan has a very confused relationship with inflation. On the one hand, they want some inflation because they've been stuck in a deflationary state for ages. On the other hand, it looks like it's running a bit hotter than people would have liked. The most recent round of wage negotiations suggests that basically wage increases for workers in big companies was like nearly 6% year on year, which is just too high.
Yeah.
Basically, it's uncomfortably high. And it's just too high, guys.
Too high.
Guys, it's too high.
It's pay review next week. Everyone heard that, right?
Don't get any
6%
ideas.
too high.
Way too high.
But and if you're having to import rice, it is quite useful to have a stronger currency, for instance, especially also if you want to slightly bring down inflation. The fact that the yen is sort of surging. This is in part a story about the dollar's weakness, but also the fact that the yen is sort of like seen as an alternative reserve currency.
Yeah.
That should put a slight dampen on inflation, which I think is running a bit hotter than Ishiba and co would like.
Okay. Interesting. I'm going to leave it there because I think we are over time, but it is an interesting one. As you say, also interesting as like a test case in what Trump's negotiations look like. It's impossible to draw too many conclusions from one instance, but the stories coming out of that negotiation do suggest that future countries probably shouldn't go in with too much optimism, because it doesn't seem like the plans are super well thought out on both sides. Well, on one side primarily. Let's move to our greatest winner and biggest loser of the week. Those are two different words. One of them will be right. Okay, so the way this works is each of us will get the opportunity to vote for who we think the biggest winner or loser of the week is. We will each reveal our votes on our boards, and if there's consensus, that person moves up or down again once more on the board. If there's not, we write it down, we note it down, we keep the records. At some point, we'll share those incredible statistics. Maybe, the 25th episode.
Whoa.
Who knows? Milestone episodes. Anyway, your options for biggest winner of the week are Putin, Maloney, and Mitsotakis. Okay, Rory, we'll start on your end. Who is your ultimate winner of the week?
I wasn't 100% sure who I should go with, but I've gone for Putin in the end. I think maybe just because the stakes feel a lot higher than everyone else.
That's true.
But yeah, it's been last week in particular, this ceasefire stuff has been, good for him.
Moving in this direction for sure. Zach?
For the same reasons, I have also gone for Putin.
Ooh.
Nadja?
Same reasons too.
Whoa.
Putin.
Is he going to ruin it? He's ruined it.
We got it!
Oh, he's done it.
Yay! It's the
All of
first
us
time.
smiling, holding up Vladimir Putin like
Cut that.
Okay, and your options for ultimate loser of the week. Our options for ultimate loser of the week are Cyril Ramaphosa, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Ishiba. This one feels harder to reach a consensus on, maybe. Rory, let's start down your end again. Your ultimate loser of the week.
Netanyahu.
Netanyahu.
He's had a bad time. I was tempted by Trump because it is pretty bad week for Trump, but I thought Netanyahu is in a bit of a crisis mode at the moment. So,
That's true.
Yeah.
Also, Trump's already at the bottom of the board,
True.
so even if he gets voted down, he can't go anywhere again anyway.
Yeah, the longer we talk about it, the more I thought he was in trouble. I've gone for BB as well.
Interesting.
No way.
Yay, BB.
What?
Oh no.
Again.
No.
Oh,
Sorry.
so close.
So close.
Oh.
Totally fair though. I do see that. And as we say, the escalating situation in the entire region, well, not even the escalating, the de-escalating in some ways, situation in the region doesn't bode well for him.
Last, can I say, I know we finished last thing. I just had a thought.
Go on.
I do think it's great. Like, I think actually what's really interesting is you compare to Trump's first term, there's a real symmetry here, but it's what, symmetry? Sort of, yeah. It was all about creating an anti-Iran axis, right? Bringing the Saudis and close to Israel. And what seems to be sort of quietly happening is we might be creating a sort of de facto anti-Israel axis if the Saudis and the rest of the Arab states get close to Iran in exchange. You'd be, I mean, you wouldn't have imagined it back in Trump's first term.
You really wouldn't.
Crazy.
And this is where the leaderboard sits at the end of the episode. Some pretty big movement. We've not had a new suggestion in a while. We've not got any new additions. Obviously, we took a whole bunch of people off with the purge a few weeks back. And obviously, the audience get the opportunity to move people, as do you. But remember, if you want to add people to the board as audience members, you're more than welcome to. The top suggestion in the comments, top voter suggestion in the comments, will be the one that is added or moved next week. So cast your votes, comment your things, like the ones you agree with, and we will make sure to address it next week within reason.
Within reason. Sorry. Yeah.
You got to say it every time legally, otherwise
That's true.
the lawyers have warned us that if we don't, we're in big trouble. Okay, we'll be back here next week with more winners, more losers, more leaderboards. Well, same leaderboards.
More leaderboards.
Well, who knows?
After the 21, yeah.
Nice.
That was good. I like the little wake.